Thank you. Thank you for having me. Before I get onto the objects, I would like to give like a short introduction about the site and like about the provenance of the objects. Trimontium was a Roman cavalry fort near Newstead, which is near Melrose, at the River Tweed in the Scottish borders, 60 miles north of the Hadrian's Wall. It was the largest outpost fort in Scotland and occupied for over 100 years, from about 79 to 184 AD. It got its name from the Eildon Hills close by. These have three tops, so as you can see here in this virtual drawing. The Roman fort was excavated by James Curl, a solicitor and hobby archaeologist from Melrose, and later on a curator of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. He undertook the excavations between 1905 and 1910, and by 1911 had already published his archaeological finds in a comprehensive work with the title A Roman Frontier Post and Its People. It is a very detailed documentation of the excavations and finds and includes an interpretation of the different phases of occupation. And Owen, it's online, so it's available online. So under Newstead, so I think I shared the link somewhere. Yeah, philsnewstead.org.uk. Most of the finds were found in pits, of which there were 117. These pits varied considerably in size. They were from 2 meters up to 10 meters deep, and from 60 centimeters up to 3 meters wide. All in all, over 6,000 objects were found, 125 of them made of leather, which were very well preserved. The most interesting ones are 16 shoes, fragments of tents, and a rare chamfron, a horse mask decorated with brass studs. The finds were acquired in 1914 by the former National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, now National Museum Scotland. I'll come to the historic preservation of the finds. It is evident that the finds had been preserved shortly after they were excavated. A literature review revealed that they had undergone treatment after they were acquired by the former National Museum of Antiquities. Interestingly, James Curl played an important part, not only in the preservation of his finds, but to achieve that in setting up a conservation laboratory in the museum. Evidence is found in the article Memoirs, James Curl and Arthur Edwards, which was published in 1944 in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Here the author states that Curl was concerned about the condition of the finds and that he expressed the need to preserve them. According to the article, he convinced the Board of Trustees of the museum to fund the purchase of conservation equipment and with it to evolve a further aim of the museum, the preservation of the objects within its care. In 1912, Arthur Edwards joined the museum as assistant keeper. He had professional knowledge of chemistry and was appointed to establish a conservation lab. After the laboratory was set up, the finds from Trimontium and from other excavations were preserved. Unfortunately, no records exist which state what materials had been used. As stated, Trimontium finds are now in the care of the National Museum of Scotland. However, a number of objects are on permanent loan to the Trimontium Trust and its museum in Melrose. Their aim is to protect the site and to tell the story of the fort to local communities. In 2021, Trimontium Museum was refurbished and with it its gallery space extended and a new display developed. For this, over 200 objects were prepared by NMS for a long-term loan. 3 of these selected objects were leather shoes. The first one is a heavy hobnail shoe made out of thick leather with 4 latchet holes. That's number 95. 96 is also studded and has pierced ornaments of lines radiating from the latchet holes, and also have like a egg-shaped punch work along the rim. And the third one is a small child's shoe made out of one piece of leather with pierced reticulated rim. When I assessed the objects, I realized that all leather objects are black and stiff and brittle, and that there are some deformations and folds present in the upper areas where the leather hadn't been or couldn't be supported during the previous treatment. There are cracks in the outer surface in the grain layer, followed by a separation of the grain layer from the corium. And in some cases, it also led to areas of loss in that grain layer. Deeper cracks, especially along the pierced leather, led to separation and loss of fragments. Previous intervention also caused some negative impact. Cotton thread used to tie leather fragments together is sometimes overly tight and cause deformations and stress to the material. And on some shoes, you can see that there are some old consolidant present, so there's some shiny residues, and there's a white bloom, which hadn't been analyzed yet, but we think it might be the crystallization of fatty acids coming out of the material. When I assessed the shoes and talked to the curators, I became aware that these 3 shoes are only the tip of an iceberg, and that there are hundreds of leather objects in the same condition or worse in our collection. Therefore, my initial goal was to find out what consolidant had been used in the past, to work out how to address the objects selected for the loan, and to assess how we can move forward with preserving the remaining objects in our collection. However, at the time of the project, we had just returned to work after lockdown and had a huge backlog to face. So unfortunately, there were no resources available at that time to assess objects in store or to analyze a sample. Whilst I examined the 3 leather shoes and tested various solvents, I started to suspect that the mysterious consolidant might be a drying oil. Just recently, this suspicion was confirmed by analysis undertaken by our analytical scientist, Dr. Laura Tualen. The FDIR spectrum suggests that the presence of an oil on the surface of the leather and has a possible match with a drying oil, such as tongue oil or linseed oil. Additionally, XRF analysis picked up traces of lead, which had been used as polymerization catalyst in drying oils to speed up the drying time. The FDIR analysis was also useful to establish the condition of the leather. No amides 1 and 2 bands could be detected, which suggests that the leather is very degraded. I also included here the spectrum of castor oil down here, as I read that castor oil was widely used in the past to preserve organic material. So this might also be a possibility. Unfortunately, we don't have the methods to specify which of these oils was used, but I would like to do some more research into that. The aim of the recent conservation treatment was to stabilize the shoes so that they were fit to go on permanent display into the Trimontium Museum. I therefore focused on an initial surface clean and an effective consolidation method and reintegration of broken fragments. The surface clean involved the removal of dust, but also of the white bloom. This was undertaken using a soft brush and a museum bag with HEPA filter. I also tested various solvents to reduce the shiny excess of consolidant and found that IDA applied to makeup sponges worked quite well. To stabilize the shoes, I had to think about how to reintroduce a consolidant into the pre-treated leather, as IDA showed a positive effect on reducing the excess material on the surface. I assumed that a consolidant dissolved in the same solvent would be able to penetrate the surface. For further advice and also a second opinion, I contacted a fellow student, Ms. Juliane Bausewein at the LBR Landesmuseum in Bonn, and she suggested trying Lucille G. She uses this on her fresh finds, but said she doesn't have experience with working with old finds. But I thought I'd just give it a try, and I made up different solutions of Lucille G and tested them. I found that the leather absorbed the consolidant very well, and that the leather became temporarily pliable again. This enabled me to add another step to the treatment, the reshaping of bent and deformed leather. While this was not one of my initial aims, I realized that the reshaping would enable me to consolidate less accessible areas and therefore to increase the stability of the objects. This was, for example, the case with the pierced leather on shoe number 96. Here, the radiating lines on the right side of the shoe were crushed and covered by the leather from the left side of the shoe. At this shoe, the reshaping also benefited the interpretation and visual appearance of the object. All reshaping was undertaken gradually during the consolidation process. Lucille G was applied to the corium, so to the inner side of the shoe, and after the consolidant had time to penetrate and soften the leather, the area was carefully pushed into shape with Berner carbon clamps. Melinex and in some cases thick PVA sheets were used as interlayer to apply the pressure more evenly. The clamps were kept in place until the consolidant had fully dried. In one area at shoe number 104, the child's shoe, had to remove the cotton threads at the instep as the threads were cutting into the leather and would have prevented a successful reshaping and subsequently a reintegration of broken leather fragments. And this brings me to the next point, the reintegration. For deep cracks and delaminating leather, I chose 5 to 10% Lucille G. I found it sufficient to bond layers of leather where there was a large contact area. However, this method alone was not strong enough to hold fragments with small contact points in place, such as the strips and lines of pierced leather, especially when the fragment has only one attachment point and must withstand gravity. In such cases, I chose to support reattached fragments with strips of tinted Japanese tissue or rime. Depending on the need, I chose the more pliable Japanese tissue for a light support and the stronger and more rigid rime for bridging narrow strips of leather. I continued using 10% Lucille G for the actual bond between fragments, but used the much stronger Lascaux 498 HB to apply the strips of rime to the back, the corium of the leather fragments, to bridge and stabilize the bond even further. To achieve a good bond, I used Berner carbon clamps or mini pegs to apply pressure to the materials whilst the adhesive was drying. And on this slide, the reintegration of two fragments close to the heel of shoe number 104 is shown. To the fragments, strips of rime were applied before reintegration and allowed to dry. Then adhesive was applied to the remaining tissue and the fragment was reintegrated. In some cases, an additional strip of rime had to be applied to the back of the fragment to increase the strength of the area. And you can see that here, so I'll just, we're about to place that onto the back. This method proved to be very successful, so that even the floating lines, as I call them, on shoe number 96 are now held in place. These strips are only attached at one end and are oriented horizontally. So it's here. So they don't have any contact anymore to this fragment. Therefore, the bond had to withstand quite a strong force, and the remake achieved that. And here are some images of the shoe number 96, before and after the treatment. The consolidation of the leather improved its inner structural stability. The leather looks and feels healthier again. And the reshaping and reintegration of the leather fragments supported the stability of the object's shape. And here are some slides before and after of the shoe number 104, the child's shoe. Was not as obvious as on shoe 96. The shoe in itself is structurally stable again. Yeah, well, thank you.
My name is Melissa Allen. I'm currently at Clemson University's Warren Lash Conservation Center. The focus of my fellowship here is the conservation and restoration of the leather shoes of the crew members of the H.L. Hunley submarine. Before I get into the specifics of the shoes, though, I wanted to give you all a bit more background on the project and the lab itself. The Warren Lash Conservation Center, or WLCC, serves as the repository for the collection of the H.L. Hunley submarine project, which is currently undergoing conservation and documentation. The submarine was launched off the coast of Charleston in 1864, and it's historically significant as it was the first submarine to successfully sink an enemy ship in battle. The wrought iron submarine was man-powered, with room for only 8 crew members, 7 of whom turned hand cranks to power the propeller, and 1 to sit under the forward conning tower as captain and principal navigator. After it was lost at sea on February 17, 1864, the location of the Hunley was officially rediscovered in 1995. It was then raised in 2000 and brought to the WLCC for excavation and conservation, which is what you're seeing here in the image on the left. The submarine was found on the seafloor, listing to the starboard side at a 45-degree angle, which was maintained during the raising and excavation so as not to compromise any critical positionings of the human remains and artifacts within. At the WLCC, the submarine was placed in a 50-ton steel tank filled with water specifically designed to conserve the vessel. It was also designed to maintain a cooler temperature for the prevention of biological growth with the use of tank chillers and a water recirculation system. The excavation of the submarine's interior involved the collaborative work of both archaeological and conservation teams. Initial examination revealed that the interior of the vessel was almost entirely filled with sediment. This indicated the potential for good preservation of artifacts as well as the submarine hull and components. The interior excavation was facilitated by the removal of several top plates, allowing for access through these openings. So that's the process you see in this sequence of images, where on the top left, a plate has undergone deconcretion and then is being removed to reveal the layers of sediment. And then finally, in the last picture, at the beginning of the excavation process, with regular layers following a grid pattern, where some deviation might have happened in some cases due to the restricted nature of the submarine's hull. So this method of excavation allowed for the very precise positioning of artifacts, as can be seen represented in this image, which was created using a Rhino 3D scanner. The artifacts were mapped using a total station to record their positionings and then added to the digital site plan. This particular image highlights in which position in each grid the shoes of the crew members were found. So what we're looking at here is kind of a bird's eye view of the submarine, and you can see how each crew member's shoes were highlighted in different colors based on their position in the submarine, generally near where they would have been sitting in front of those hand cranks that I mentioned earlier. So over 3,000 objects have been recovered from the submarine, including personal artifacts of the crew and hull, as well as hull components in various states of degradation. Having spent over 100 years at the bottom of the Charleston Harbor, the submarine became covered with concretions that were a result of many years of macrofungal growth and debris accumulation on the surface of the submarine, where it rested on the seafloor. This growth combined with iron corrosion products form marine concretions in all areas of the submarine itself, as well as encapsulating several of the artifacts within. So in these images, you can see on the left, two conservators in action as they work to deconcrete the sub itself. And then on the right, an image that was taken of the sub in its tank in the WLCC after it had been righted from that 45-degree angle. So this is post-excavation of the interior, and you can see how those plates have been removed in order to allow that access. During the excavation, each artifact was uncovered, documented, and recovered individually. This practice, however, was not suitable for many of the shoes and textiles and other garments of the crew that were often found to be too fragile to be lifted separately out of concretions or sediment. For this reason, they had to be block lifted in order to excavate them to a more controlled laboratory setting. Conservators prepared the block lifts by probing the sediment using wooden tools, as you can see on the top image over there on the left. These divided the blocks along the edges of major artifacts and bone clusters. Archaeologists mapped the position of each block lift within the submarine using laser tracking point measurement system. Each block was then carefully separated and transported to the analytical lab, which are the other two images on the top you see. In total, the team removed a total of 49 block lifts, 16 of which contained the leather shoes of the crew, along with sediment matrix, socks, and foot bones, which you can see in the bottom images. While in the laboratory, conservators x-rayed all the block lifts to identify the location of each bone and artifact before carefully cleaning away the sediment with low-pressure water jets. The shoes containing the block lifts were then stored in a walk-in cooler kept at 4 degrees Celsius in water while they awaited further conservation. During that time, the bones were removed from the shoes and samples of footprints, hair, skin, sediment, and textiles were taken. So then after each shoe had been isolated, it was further cleaned by mechanical means using low pressure water jets with or without powder, depending on the hardness of the concretions surrounding it. Sometimes the concretions were so hard that a chisel and hammer were required, but in most cases, the use of the Cavatron ultrasonic dental scaler with water spray was sufficient. Once sufficiently cleaned, most shoes were treated in a 5% weight to volume solution of ammonium citrate to remove iron oxides from the leather. They were then thoroughly rinsed with deionized water, and at that point they were ready for freeze-drying pre-treatment, with PEG 400, followed by freeze-drying until stable as temperature was increased. The shoes were then stored in an organics room at 50% relative humidity and monitored for changes in weight. All 16 shoes were excavated, documented, and freeze-dried in this manner. At that point, when the leather was dried and stable enough, some of the shoes required further consolidation and structure supports due to several missing fragments. Various tests and research was done in order to treat the leather using different consolidants and adhesives. Areas where the leather was very thin were lined with Japanese paper and which was adhered with AYAA glue or PVA, and separating soles or heel supports were reattached with thread and or adhesives. So in some cases, both silk and or moisturized cotton threads were used. In other cases, PVAs were used. At that point, the shoes were placed in storage on foam and inert textile for support, and they would largely be left for almost 2 decades until the approaching possibility of their imminent display instigated my arrival at the Warren Lash to reassess their condition and continue with those reconstruction efforts. So for this point on, I'm going to use a rather interesting and unique case study of a particular shoe to illustrate my ongoing work. So this here is the left shoe of one of the crew members of the Hunley, identified as individual GG. Stylistically, the shoe has been identified as a Brogan style half boot. This is in line with the majority of the shoes found in the Hunley. 6 out of 8 pairs of shoes were able to be identified as Brogan style, which were very common during the Civil War as footwear for soldiers. There were, however, 2 exceptions to that rule on the Hunley. The captain of the vessel was identified as wearing a pair of mid-calf riding boots, and another crew member's shoes were identified as low quarter shoes. So you can see here on the image on the left, a diagram which identifies the different components of Brogan shoes. And then on the right, a pair of, not our case study, but actually a different Hunley crew member identified as EEs, Brogans, which were the best preserved pair and also the most typical with the Brogan style. So materials for making shoes were extremely hard to come by during the American Civil War. And therefore, many of the brogans that were made as simply as possible with only 2 holes to place laces through and without metal eyelets. You can see here on the image on the left, EE's shoes, which we just saw on the last slide. But here I've highlighted how, in this case, there are 3, not 2 eyelets, but that there are no metal supports. Reinforced copper eyelets were no longer being used in the construction of shoes by the South at that point because of the scarcity of copper alloy. That is one way in which GG's brogans, pictured here on the right, differ from the typical military issue. They have 4 copper metal alloy eyelets on either side of the quarter, as well as a reinforced heel. And this suggests that they were likely civilian shoes that predated the war. Another explanation may lie in the history of the individual of GG. GG served in the Federal Navy prior to the American Civil War and defected to the South after conflict broke out. So these shoes might have been issued to him during that time and during his time in the Federal Navy, which might explain their higher quality than the standard issue brogans seen on Confederate soldiers. Individual GG was also found with several other articles of clothing that he would have received during his tenure in the Federal Navy, such as his Navy pea coat, black cap, neckerchief, and his shirts. During the excavation of GG's shoes, they were X-rayed and CT scanned to identify relevant material inside the block lift. The leather was identified by Mr. Roy Thompson of the Leather Conservation Center as a vegetable tan bovine leather. Like many of the Hunley artifacts, GG shoes were stained by iron corrosion products. However, the extent of the staining was not immediately recognized by conservators due to the darkness of the leather after initial wet cleaning procedures, as you can see in these images here. After PEG and freeze drying treatment, the leather could be clearly identified as significantly lighter with strong red undertones. This experience with this particular shoe is part of what led to the 5% ammonium citrate bath in the standard treatment plan for the other shoes that I outlined earlier in this presentation. This shoe was placed in a 30% PEG 400 solution for 3 weeks and was regularly checked on during that time for evaporation. The PEG was then rinsed off and a plastic support placed inside the shoe during freeze drying to maintain its shape. The shoe was placed in the freezer at -30 degrees Celsius for pre-freezing and allowed to sit there for 4 days. It was then transferred to the freeze dryer. The toe cap, which was discovered apart from the shoe, was sewn back onto the sole using mercerized cotton thread coated in microcrystalline wax, and this sewing was done through the original sole holes already present in the shoe. The quarter on the proper right side, where 3 eyelets can be seen in this image here, was further mounted with Japanese paper fills to provide the support that it required. There has been a significant shift in the coloration of the shoes between the time they were initially treated and their current appearance, as you can see in these 2 images here. I mentioned how the initial darkness of the shoes when wet transitioned to a much lighter red appearance after treatments, and that appearance has continued to shift since that point, darkening over the past almost 2 decades since the freeze drying treatment. We're currently working with the assumption that darkening has been caused by the leather absorbing humidity from the air. In spite of the desire to store the shoes in a relatively stable environment during the first several years after the initial conservation, the shoes did experience some inconsistency, including fluctuations in relative humidity during the humidic summer months and the dry winters. This shift has resulted in some of the previously applied paper fills appearing more visually as evident than desired. And we are considering if the leather is stable enough to remove those old paper fills, or if instead we'll perhaps layer differently toned Japanese tissue on top of the current fills, which might be sufficient to prevent the eye being drawn to conservation intervention rather than the original material. Over the past 9 years, the shoes have been stored in a container that has been able to be kept consistently in the range of 45 to 55% RH. Which has halted the shift in color and thereby encourages us in our efforts to find a better match for its current tone. One area of very thin and unstable leather along the outside of the shoe remained unsupported even after past conservation intervention. I therefore created a new fill using Japanese paper tinted with acrylic paint and applied using a 1-to-1 mixture of Lasco 303 and Lasco 498. In this sequence of images, you can see at the top a red arrow indicating the unstable piece of leather, and then in the image on the bottom left, a blue arrow indicating the leather fill as it was applied to either side of the area needing support. Then finally, in the image on the right, you see it as it looks now, fully supported. So I tested different methods of application for this fill, including heat reactivation, but ultimately chose to apply the Lascaux mixture while still wet and clamp the fill in place. In this instance, that technique proved appropriate, but if anyone has any other recommendations, I am still curious about the possibility of heat reactivation going forward, because I've had success in other delicate treatment cases. In my tests here, I was able to achieve a okay level of adhesion using heat reactivation, but I didn't find the joint to be as secure as when I applied the Lascaux mixture wet and clamped it. I also had some concerns about the way in which the peg impregnated leather would react to heat. So if anyone has any insights in this area, I would love to chat about it after the talk. The other interesting thing about this particular shoe is that there's a relatively large fragment on of the outside quarter, which was never removed from its concretion. This fragment, which consists of leather, copper alloy eyelets, fragments of shoelace, as well as wool sock, was considered to be too fragile to remove from this very hard concretion when it was initially cleaned. And it was also considered that it would be valuable as an educational piece to demonstrate what condition and context many of the artifacts had been found in. The concretion containing the fragment was found right up against the hull, which is why the very hard concretion only formed on one side of the artifact. Despite remaining attached to the concretion, the fragment was treated in a similar way to the other leather shoes. It was mechanically cleaned with a Jet and Calvatron, then soaked in a 5% ammonium citrate for 2 hours to eliminate iron corrosion products from the leather, rinsed and then soaked in a 30% solution of PEG 400. In this case, the PEG also contained a corrosion inhibitor added so that the concretion, which contains such high levels of iron oxide, wouldn't react with the PEG, as well as Nalco 7730, a biocide, in an effort to reduce the risk of biological growth in the PEG bath. It was then rinsed following PEG treatment and freeze-dried. It was placed in a sealed package with low humidity and oxygen scavengers in an effort to slow the ongoing corrosion of the iron products inherent to the concretion. The fragment, as you can see in this image, looks as though it's showing a row of 5 eyelets. So that's identified in the image on the left with those arrows. This was interesting to archaeologists, as it would have indicated that the Brogan style boot reached a higher point on the wearer's ankle than most Brogans. However, upon closer examination, it's now believed that the fragment of leather contained in this last eyelet in the row actually belongs with the other side of the quarter that is currently supported by the tinted Japanese paper in position with the rest of the shoe. So this is indicated in the image on the right, where you can see the smaller fragment outlined in blue and the larger fragment outlined in red. The leather fragments in the concretion are still too fragile to be separated from the very hard concretion without causing significant damage to the leather. However, as long as they remain associated with the concretion, they will continue to degrade, as the associated damage caused by the high levels of corrosion products that are inherent to the concretion. What is more, especially now that it's understood that the correct interpretation of the shoe would be represented by 4 eyelets on either side of the quarter, it's not ideal to have this fragment showing 5 eyelets in a row and the shoe representing over 3 on the other side. So what to do? We determined that it would be best to create replicas of these 2 fragments stuck in concretion. One replica of the smaller fragment with a single eyelet, which could be attached to the previously constructed paper support on the proper right side of the shoe, as demonstrated in this image here. The other replicated fragment would represent the proper left quarter with a row of 4 eyelets, and it could be attached to the shoe's mount in an appropriate position. So the current plan for the mount is to carve it from ethafoam and cover it in cotton stocking. The replicated fragment could then be sewed onto this cotton stocking in the appropriate position. This was considered the most ethically sound solution, as opposed to attaching the replicated portion directly to the artifact. With this presentation, the shoe will be able to be viewed as a close as possible representation to the complete remains of the artifact. But the fragments in the concretion can continue to be used for educational purposes, be demonstrating the process of archaeological excavation and conservation intervention of the Hunley artifacts. Today, the Hunley submarine resides in a large tank filled with a very high pH solution of sodium hydroxide. The long process of removing the concretion is approaching its end, with only the very hardest thin layer of concretions remaining in some areas. The tank is therefore occasionally drained, so these final stages of deconcreting can be carried out, as you see here in this image on the right. The reconstruction of the shoes of the Hunley crew members will continue over the next several months. We will continue to monitor the leather of the shoes closely and make note of any continuing shift in coloration. At the end of the reconstruction and remounting, the shoes will be ready for display along many of the other artifacts from this historic vessel. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions.